Hi, everyone.
Morning.
Um,
Afternoon.
can you hear me
Hello.
okay?
Hello. Hello.
Hi. Um, should we introduce ourselves? And who wants to go first? I'm Michelle Rosga. I'm an assistant professor of English at Norfolk State University here in the Hampton Roads area of Virginia. And the name of my paper is Contagion of Grief, Orphans, Theft of Language, and Loss During War and Economic Crisis. How about you, Ms. Zach?
So I'm Elizabeth Zach. I'm a PhD student in information science at the University of Iowa. I got my master's last semester, and I'm going to be talking about the misinformed dying, where we're going to explore misinformation in Stuart Annan's book, A Prayer for the Dying.
Thanks. And how about you, Mark?
My name is Mark Walder. I teach philosophy at a place called Aurora University. I am saying a few things about a novel by Clarice Lispector called The Hour of the Star.
Welcome, everyone. Does anyone have a deep preference about going first? And actually, let me introduce Paige, my former colleague, and very sad that she left last year. I got to know her at work for 2 years. She's our Dean of the Honors College, Professor Emeritus at Norfolk State, and we miss her dearly.
Hey,
Thanks
guys.
for being here, Paige.
Of course.
So should we go in alphabetical, or how would you feel comfortable?
It's fine with me.
Okay, actually, should we go alphabetical by first or last name?
Either way is fine. I think I'm the first one in the ordering on the website, but I obviously don't have to go first, but I can. Because I think I'm the first name.
Please, please.
Go right ahead.
Yeah.
So my paper is called The Misinformed Dying, Reading a Prayer for the Dying During the Coronavirus Pandemic. And I'm going to begin with the abstract. An unprecedented pandemic results in a slew of misinformation. A prayer for the dying can serve as a harbinger for our own coronavirus pandemic in 3 ways: disease as the great equalizer, hubris as immunity, and delusion as misinformation of the mind. Originally, I was going to talk about the 3 of these, but I decided to focus more on disease as the great equalizer and hubris as immunity, as I found that those were both a little more interesting. Unfortunately, while we remain optimistic in this pandemic, there is no optimism in the ending of A Prayer for the Dying. Although the book ends with the town being burned and a sense of renewal, this plague of misinformation is really only in its early stages. So reading A Prayer for the Dying through a lens of misinformation allows us to see the lies that we tell both ourselves and others. A Prayer for the Dying explores plague and quarantine in a very small town named Friendship. However, when diphtheria spreads through the town, despite the quarantine, the survivors eventually abandon it. This automatically presents a lot of similarities to the coronavirus pandemic, but specifically, disease is the great equalizer and hubris as immunity. Understanding the parallels between literature and reality can serve as both a fantasy and a mirror, and we understand reality through the context of fiction and vice versa. So in this specific case, A Prayer for the Dying allows us to juxtapose this reality between the town of Friendship and their handling of diphtheria. So in this paper, I argue that the misinformation serves as a detriment toward the people, and specifically those who are the most vulnerable and the people who the townspeople are meant to protect. I'm going to begin with a brief summary of the book and then turn to my 2 main argument points. Has anyone here read A Prayer for the Dying? Okay.
You're going to have to tell us everything about it.
I will. I'm glad that I've got the summary then. I was a little worried that everyone would have read it and the summary would be superfluous, but it explores plague and quarantine in a small Wisconsin town. When an unexpected rise in illness and death occurs in the population due to diphtheria, the protagonist, who is the sheriff, the undertaker, the pastor, and also an unreliable narrator, his name is Jacob, works with the town doctor to limit the spread of diphtheria. So initially they set up this 2-week quarantine where no one will enter Friendship and no one will leave. And they assume that in 2 weeks, the disease will run its course. And the minor quarantine will still allow people to live their everyday lives. But instead, the diphtheria attacks a number of townspeople, killing them, including Jacob's wife, Marta, and daughter, Amelia. And although the quarantine is meant to last 2 weeks, the virus continues to spread through friendship. Initial efforts to limit the spread in the population are unsuccessful, and so Jacob and the rest of the men of the town turn to less transparent means of containment, turning away a local circus which is fleeing the surrounding wildfires, locking the infected in their homes and not letting them go about their daily business, and eventually burning the houses of the dead. Again, however, they're unsuccessful. So finally, the townspeople decide to allow the surrounding wildfires to consume the town. They pack their belongings and they abandon it. And before joining everyone, Jacob realizes that he has been the primary agent in spreading the virus through his contact with everyone who has died. And upon finally burying his wife and child, he walks back toward the town prepared to die. So there are a lot of similarities between Onan's plague experience and coronavirus that merit attention. I'm going to focus on those pertaining to misinformation because I am a misinformation scholar. And by misinformation, I mean information that is false, that is spread by people. But what's really important about misinformation is that misinformation is typically believed by those who spread it. They think it's real. Disinformation is propaganda that is spread by people who know that it's not true. But for all intents and purposes in this book, we're going to be exploring misinformation. Jacob is an unreliable narrator, and the book is told from a second-person perspective, which really allows us to understand that this is misinformation. This is what's going on. Is, Jacob genuinely believes that what he is doing is the right thing, even though he has no findings to support it. So first, I'm going to talk about coronavirus as the great equalizer. After the first death, which is caused by an outside soldier, the town doctor encourages Jacob to bury the man, telling him to just get him in the ground and be careful on how he's handled. So rather than giving the man the typical funeral treatment, Jacob only buries him. Similarly, when he visits the Holy Colony, which is a polygamous religious sect, his wife tells him to be careful and tells him that the whole place could be diseased the way that they live. Later, when two young men in the town die, Jacob acknowledges them and says, "You've always thought of them as mean, evil children, and now ashamed to forgive them everything. They were just wild boys who were high-spirited." In their death, he relents, and he feels sympathy towards them. However, it's Jacob and the doctor's dismissal of their own symptoms that we can view as leading to their eventual death. Later, when Jacob burns down a house at the doctor's request, he realizes that there is still someone inside. When you all saw the figure in the attic window in the invalid room, banging at the glass with her frail bare arms, the slow aunt from Montclair, you'd all forgotten her. And rather trying to save her, Jacob and his compatriots choose to let her die. Each of these people's suffering is treated with less and less reverence until they're actively causing someone's death. And what we can see is that each of these people are outsiders in the town. The aunt from Montclair is a geographic outsider, as is the soldier. The two sons are products of a widowed mother. I mentioned her a little later in the paper. And then the Holy Colony is different based on their polygamous tradition. And because of this, Jacob and the doctor really don't take their cases as seriously, and also assume that external factors are what have caused the diphtheria or contributed to the diphtheria. It's not until they're dead that they are treated with the sympathy and respect that they should have been getting all along. And this is similar to coronavirus. I think we all remember that in the early days of the pandemic, it was kind of viewed as this great equalizer, but that's not the case. When understanding the risk of contracting coronavirus, we know now that men's risk of developing and dying from coronavirus is markedly increased depending on their socioeconomic status. Ebert et al. Published a report explaining those who are most affected by coronavirus, and that socioeconomic status is a really large divisor. Race is a great divisor as well, since 90% of high poverty neighborhoods whose residents are primarily people of color are highly vulnerable, while only 56% of high poverty tracts that are at least 50% white are highly vulnerable. Children are also affected by this socioeconomic disparity far beyond the coronavirus disease's ailments, and this can influence the learning that students do. Agustinelli et al. Learned that high school students in poor neighborhoods are negatively impacted with a learning loss of 0.4%, while their rich neighborhood counterparts are not impacted. And we can kind of see that maybe in this case, death rather than coronavirus or diphtheria is the great equalizer. So now I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about men and hubris and immunity. Now, throughout the book, we view Jacob and the various men of the town ignoring basic safety and hygienic guidelines. However, they impose these guidelines on others in the village. Jacob passes judgment on others he deems lesser than himself, considering that some form of madness must accompany the sickness. Is that diphtheria? He allows the idea of difference to affect his own initial conceptualization of the virus, and although inaccurate, this coloring of the virus really persists in his mind. When he sees Sarah Ramsey, a single mother whose children have contracted diphtheria, he considers her own bad luck with judgment, thinking, she's gone through 2 husbands, both drinkers, and lives off the insurance money. Now, although she's led a very hard life, Jacob will not offer her sympathy, and instead he considers her lazy. Later in the book, he bars her up in her home by explaining that at least this will keep other people safe. However, there are alternatives, and we can see this through the way that the town's men treat each other. Jacob sees that the town doctor's hand is swollen and his fingers are puffy and discolored. Now, this is, in fact, a physical sign of diphtheria, one that the 2 men have seen previously time and time again. However, Jacob ignores this, choosing to believe that Sarah Ramsey attacked the doctor, and that's why his hand is swollen, rather than understanding the reality, even when you could see that his fingers were puffed with infection. Finally, at the end of the novel, the doctor confirms that he has diphtheria and has been hiding the infection. And Jacob is really disappointed in this, considering that he made it so long you thought he was like you, that he couldn't get it. Jacob assumes that he is immune, although there has been absolutely no evidence of this. Another example of this toxic masculinity is Jacob's treatment of his wife in both life and death. Jacob implicitly believes he is immune to the virus, and when he first learns of the disease, he's mostly ignorant and knows that it kills, and that's enough. When his wife suggests leaving the town, Jacob discourages her, encouraging her to stay with him, and he tells her not to leave him and take their daughter, and not to leave with him and take their daughter either. Rather than listening to her logic, he chooses to believe that everything will be fine, eventually convincing her to stay. Even when Jacob's daughter is sick, he refuses to acknowledge it, stating that even though there's the proof and you know what it means, you can't understand it. Later, when Jacob's wife dies, he is unable to bury her. Instead, he dresses her and continues to behave as if she is alive in every sense of the word, choosing to kiss her deeply, run your hands over her cool, perfect skin, take her face in your hands. Now, in fact, at the end of the book, Jacob realizes that it is you, it's been you this whole time. All of them, Marta, Doc, Sarah Ramsey. It must have first been the soldier and then no one but you. But this realization is far too late. The town is burning up, and Jacob has inadvertently killed his family and friends. He has no one to blame but himself, as he has ignored the guidelines placed on others, and he has flaunted his own so-called immunity, when in fact he's the one who's been spreading the virus throughout the town. Now, similarly, we can see a lot of hubris and a lot of belief of immunity, or just not acknowledging the coronavirus pandemic. A paper published found that men were less likely than women to wear a face covering, but men more so than women felt uncomfortable wearing a face covering. Back in March, a Kaiser Family Foundation article explained that only 11% of men had bought a mask, and I'm referring to March 2020, not March 2021, I'm sorry. Now, this trend of men ignoring the coronavirus and believing in their own immunity has continued. And Caparo and Barcelo found that men are less likely than women to wear a face mask, and that men are less likely to believe that they will be affected or impacted by coronavirus. Even though the vaccine has proven to be largely successful, there's a large portion of people who have decided that they will not be getting it. And this can be viewed both in religious lines and both between gender. One poll taken a few weeks ago stated that 49% of Republican men have reported that they will not be getting the vaccine. So A Prayer for the Dying is a horror novel. However, I think that we can all agree that reality has surpassed this horror on a national stage, and an international one as well. While today we can view Prayer for the Dying as an omen of the coronavirus, its initial writing was a bleak examination of humanity. However, today's climate of misinformation presents new challenges. Mask wearing and contact tracing are 2 relatively new developments in combating a novel virus. Unfortunately, the death toll is still incredibly high. While there are certainly differences between the diphtheria outbreak and the coronavirus pandemic, we can see that some lies and some beliefs are timeless. Although the town of Friendship is eventually destroyed, We can only hope that the vaccine and the future will result in a much less incendiary cleansing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We could hear you very well. There was some occasional distortion. So just now, I
Oh.
apologize. I was trying to figure out if I muted everyone, if that would reduce it, but we could hear you. Don't worry about it. It just
Okay.
would come, it would bite like one word away from your sentence, and it only happened
Okay.
a few times. Don't worry. We can
Okay.
hear it. Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Thank you.
Is it agreeable for all of us that we have questions and discussion after everyone's done? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So I did look at
That seems
socio.
to make sense. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I looked at socio, and I guess I'm supposed to be next. Unless Mark, you have a strong preference, I'll go ahead and do that.
No, I don't. I'm fine. That's great. You know,
Okay.
Michelle, let me ask you
Yeah,
one question though. I can
please.
hear Elizabeth very well, but your volume seems to be a little lower.
All right. Is that better?
There we go. Yeah, that's
Is that better? Okay.
That helped.
I'll
Yeah,
hold
that
this
helped.
up. I'll hold this up. So hopefully that take care of it. All right. The Painted Bird, a novel that was first published in 1965 by Jerzy Kosinski, a Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor who pretended not to be Jewish, even to Elie Wiesel, is a book that was once a mainstay of high school and college syllabi, but is no longer. The novel was widely believed by audiences to be autobiographical, but turned out to have been part truth and part fiction. And though the author was layered and circumspect in his statements about the novel, he never really said that his work was autobiographical. Some researchers have written about the book without referencing its ambiguous origin stories, while others have woven that ambiguity into their arguments. My points will center on an idea I am pursuing, that the collage of fact and fantasy in The Painted Bird allows a reading of this book as a fairy tale, a fable of horror for adults that provides a catharsis as would a fairy tale for children. This book has given me the space to contemplate the ways adults may be able to unlearn their reliance on social forms of distancing from pain and suffering of others, to re-enter pity and terror, and to thereby readjust what they have agreed to accept, what they have gone to sleep on, in order to survive in the distortion and pain of modern, often destructive society. For much of The Painted Bird, which takes its title from a custom described in the book, wherein one bird of a flock is caught and painted a radically different color and then released so spectators can watch it being killed by its own, the 6-year-old boy who is the narrator wanders through some rural places in Eastern Europe, having been sent to the countryside by his parents, who are afraid of being arrested and taken to a concentration camp in the run-up to World War II. The boy is described as having dark hair, eyes, and skin, and as being a gypsy or a Jew, and he is shockingly mistreated throughout his wanderings. First, the boy lives with a superstitious elderly woman named Marta, who believes in the powers of sacred snake skins, who believes that looking into animal eyes is bad luck, and who believes that putting meat into a jar and then burying the jar is the way to cure pain. Marta dies, and the boy is put on display and then bought by an old woman named Olga the Wise One, who is a respected healer. The boy quickly takes on the belief systems of the people he lives among. In an early passage, he expresses both how he is treated and what he has come to believe of himself in the world of spells and incantations and folk remedies he at first inhabits. This evil spirit which dwelled in me attracted by its very nature other mysterious beings. Phantoms drifted around me. A phantom is silent, reticent, and is rarely seen. Yet it is persistent. It trips people in fields and forests, peeks into huts, can turn itself into a vicious cat or rabid moans when enraged. At midnight, it turns into hot tar. Olga attempts to cure a sickness the boy acquires by burying him in a field up to his neck, where he is pecked at by ravens. Later, the boy accompanies Olga when she is called to a riverside incident, and the boy loses touch with her permanently when he floats away down the river on the top of a giant inflated fish bladder. This unmooring on top of the fish bladder is symbolic of the unmoored and dangerous ways the story unfolds, tossing the boy from hut to hut, from danger to danger. At first, he is an object in the narrative rather than a subject, but he is also resourceful and seems to have great ability to live in the moment. For example, after he escapes off the top of the fish bladder, he remembers what Olga taught him about survival, what she termed those things needed for survival without human help. The boy knows he needs a heat source and cooking fire called a comet, which is a can on a line that has a small fire in it that never goes out. He gets one by stealing one and moves through the forest at night, swinging his comet on its line, able to see then the witches hanging from the trees. Soon the boy is living with a miller named Jealous, who puts out the eyes of a plowboy in a fit of rage. As a consequence, the narrator has to contemplate the disembodied eyeballs rolling on the floor, and he gives them agency, thinking to himself that maybe the eyes had no intention of serving anyone, as if they could live on their own. The boy thinks to himself, I wondered whether the loss of one's sight would deprive a person also of the memory of everything he had seen before. In the foregoing passage and throughout the novel, the boy has moments of stillness, of beforeness or afterness within the horrific events he lives through, or witnesses, or both. He seems to travel between waking and dreaming life, existing, then thinking his way through moments of exhaustion or pauses that are often filled with revelations. One important scene shows the boy absolutely desperate with sympathy for a crippled horse who he has coaxed to the home of a farmer who refuses to splint the horse's broken leg. The boy thinks, I wanted to throw myself at the farmer's feet and beg for the horse's life. But then the boy is catapulted back toward the other extreme of his existence because the farmer not only refuses to splint the leg, but also kills the horse in an extremely cruel way. The boy emotionally distances himself right away in the aftermath and even explains that he helps the farmer later to skin off the hide and cut up the carcass. At about the halfway mark of the novel, the moments of stillness and contemplation give way to additional moments when the boy, who is now several years older, begins to make value judgments about what he is experiencing. He thinks to himself, after encountering some soldiers of the Third Reich, the Germans puzzled me. What a waste. Was such a destitute, cruel world worth ruling? He also thinks, wouldn't it be easier to change people's eyes and hair than to build big furnaces and then catch Jews and gypsies to burn in them? The quality of these thoughts is for an adult constructed universe that gestures at reality, but the thoughts are a parallel mode of thought to what happens in the children's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes. You all know that story? When the emperor is told that his new invisible garments are the finest in the land, he goes out to parade in the streets naked. Only a child unconditioned by society can point and say at that moment, the emperor has no clothes. The adults in the tale cannot do that because their thoughts and customs are combined in the acceptance of lies that they are trained to believe to be necessary. Soon, the boy grows even older, and the war runs more parallel and comes more closely to him on his travels through the countryside. In a chilling allusion to the trains that brought people to their murders during the Holocaust, the boy notes that the symphony of the forest was broken only by the puffing of a locomotive, the rattle of cars, the grinding of brakes. At this point, when he is a bit older, the boy chides himself. I had been too stupid to find the governing principle of the world of people, animals, and events. He then begins at about 2/3 of the way through the novel to put his experiences into a form of argument, as a child in a fairy tale would do if he suddenly grew up and then explained the fairy tale and the lesson of it at the same moment he was living through it. For example, the boy describes seeing adults as having signed away their souls in this passage. From the moment of signing a pact with the devil, the more harm, misery, injury, and bitterness a man could inflict on those around him, the more help he could expect. If he shrank from inflicting harm on others, if he succumbed to emotions of love, friendship, and compassion, he would immediately become weaker, and his own life would have to absorb the suffering and defeats that he spared others. Sometimes the boy's details amount not so much to distilled philosophy as above, but to a form of social critique, another form of observing the lack of clothes on the emperors of belief. As when he gives the following simple response to being told about communism by some Russian soldiers. If it was true that women and children might become communal property, then every child would have many fathers and mothers, innumerable brothers and sisters. Before returning to the novel and arriving at my conclusion, I want to take a detour over to a film example. The connection is the orphan and the ways that lies can tell the truth via art and simultaneously, therefore, come under suspicion and censor. In the 1998 film by Brazilian director and writer Walter Salles, Central Station, Dora, a retired school teacher, sits in a large Rio de Janeiro train station each day, writing letters for people who can't. At the opening of the movie, which is fiction, real people were filmed with their permission in a hybrid style associated with sales called by film commentator Fabiano Canosa the aesthetics of affection, the aesthetics of solidarity. As each person who needs a letter written approaches Dora at her little table, the audience sees flushed faces on a hot day and then hears in Portuguese, or in English subtitles, in my case, the words that friends and foes entrust to her. Things like, "Thank you for what you did to me. You're the worst thing that ever happened to me." Soon the viewer learns that Dora takes the letters home and stuffs them into a drawer, pulling them out in the evening to make fun of them with her friend Irene, and mostly never mailing them as she'd promised and been paid to do. Early on in the film, Dora meets Josue, about 8, who is played by a boy who was cast not from a pool of actors, but from having been seen shining shoes at an airport. Josue's mom dictates a letter to her ex, the father of Josue, using Dora's service. But as she leaves Central Station, she is hit and killed by a bus when she is distracted by Josue's chasing down of a wooden toy made by his absent dad. This plot development ends in Dora taking Josue home for a while, but then in her own fatigue and cynicism, she takes money for him to be taken up by some people who purport to be adoptive agents, but who are really human organ sellers. Irene tries to startle Dora out of her complacency, and Dora has nightmares, then goes back to the apartment of the organ harvesters, rescues Josue, and goes on a cross-country journey with him to take him to his absent father. At the end of the tale, Dora returns to her own innocence by having helped an innocent boy. And even though Josue finds brothers, not his father, he arrives home. Meanwhile, the last scene shows Dora leaving Josue's brother's home at dawn, going back out on her own quest. Neither the narrator of The Painted Bird nor Dora of Central Station can escape the contagion of grief that has gripped their societies. What they can do is live through it And when the ties of family break and the chaos reigns, they can learn to live again by entering into a form of spontaneous, action-driven empathy. At the end of The Painted Bird, the narrator is reunited with his parents, but he also expresses regret at losing his freedom when he describes a rabbit who is freed from a cage, but then hops back into the cage of its own accord. At the beginning of the current pandemic, a film of The Painted Bird was released in Slovakia, though a recent film comment article mentions that the book has heretofore been mostly considered unfilmable. It is clear that the brutality and breadth of cruel acts that humans visit on each other and on children in The Painted Bird are the reason for this note regarding the film. I've not been able to bring myself to watch it yet, but the film's release speaks to the continued relevance of The Painted Bird to discussions of current experiences of social contagion among the vulnerable. Indeed, the very author of the book committed suicide in 1991. As Ruth Franklin noted in a recent review of a novel that an author wrote to try to figure out Mr. Kosinski's complexity, he killed himself, and many attributed his suicide to the decline of his reputation and career. It is impossible not to also see such a painful death without remembering that he was a Holocaust survivor who wrote, in part, to convey that horror that he survived. And this is my conclusion, especially now, and what we talked about in the first plenary, how can art render such stories about war atrocity, about orphans, about the epidemic of disease, of suicide, without appearing to distance itself from them? Speak to that struggle, though each of them depict the adult capacity to cheapen words, to steal them, to rob them of communicative meaning. They also each speak to the good theft, the ways that art gives back a little bit, if not even most, of what children and the vulnerable lose each day in plain sight of anyone paying attention. That's my paper.
I'm sorry, Michelle. I was muted.
I'm sorry, that's my fault. I'm supposed to be
No,
moderating.
I
that.
did it myself. I was worried. It's creak my chair and cause problems there.
I'm so sorry. I went a little too fast and I was worried because it was a little too long, but apologize.
I'll do the same thing. So we'll both be guilty. All right? So if you all forgive me. It's interesting you made reference to Central Station because I wrote this about Clarice Lispector, who is a Brazilian writer, and the novel takes place in Rio. I don't have any of you read Lispector? So this is okay.
Not yet.
Well, the best thing I could possibly do would be to somehow encourage you to want to read it. So that would be good. All right. So maybe that will happen. Anyway, so the title is A Pure Scream. The reason for that is when Lispector wrote this book, she actually gave it 14 titles. The one that you'll get on the cover of the book is The Hour of the Star, but there are 13 others, and one of them is A Pure Scream. So that's what I've chosen for the title of this paper. So without further ado, in a brief dedication by the author, actually Clarice Lispector, that prefaces the novel, the composer of The Hour of the Star eventually comes to admit, among other things, that she characteristically meditates wordlessly and upon the nothing. She follows this up by saying, furthermore, that actually what trips up her life is writing. A curious statement for any artist, not to mention one who, by the time of the publication of this novel, had been at work on the craft for the balance of the last 30 years. One might be tempted to take this as a bit of poetic hyperbole about the relation between an authorial persona and a living human being. The act of writing is not without its costs, just as it is not without its various benefits. Or perhaps it might be heard as an offhanded acknowledgement of the manifold difficulties of composition. We know that this, the very last novel published in Lispector's lifetime, took shape in an unusual way, apparently constructed by the assemble of fragments, aided by the author's secretary. Yet the overall dedicatory context in which that statement is made, 3 short paragraphs that begin by invoking the Schumanns and end with an affirmation for all of us, lends us to believe that it might also refer in some way to the multiplicity that characterizes the work itself. When she continues by saying that this I, that is all of you, since I can't stand being just me, I need others to get by, fool that I am. We could well hear it as an echo of a conscious dissemination to a kind of otherness. Somewhere exterior to the full void that you only reach through meditation, a non-place that would seem to lend itself to the division between self and other, she presumably finds a sort of I in the all of you that comes out through the characters in the work, and also perhaps in its public reception. The odd tripping up referred to in this context might then refer to a kind of stuttering of subjectivities that happens within the curious event of language. I think there's some good reasons for thinking about reading her that way, but that does not yet account for the whole story. The catch here is the conception of life with which Lispector seems to be working in saying this. The association between her apparently unarticulated meditation and the tripping up of her life also suggests that something essential about that life is found in the wordlessness of the meditative state, and not in the partitioned being made possible through language. What's more, the multiple references to music, the tempest of Beethoven, the strident cries of the electronic generation, certainly support the hypothesis that Lispector would like to hear something in the flow of sound itself that cuts to the heart of existence and is much more true to it than discrete words could ever be. This apparently Schopenhauerian conception might also help account for one of the other unusual characterizations in play here. However one might feel about the putative wordlessness of life itself, whatever that may be, it would be odd to think of that life as she seemingly does. That is, as literally nothing. Unless, of course, one would subscribe to the belief that true reality is elsewhere or otherwise. But in the end, I do not think that Lispector is a conscious or unconscious disciple of the avatar of what Nietzsche named European Buddhism. Rather, I think that somewhere between what we hear as a kind of quasi-mystical affirmation of nothingness and a recognition of the inevitability of the articulations of language, including its effects on subjectivity, we'll find a place from which we can begin to understand this statement, as well as what Lispector means by one of the other 13 titles of the book, The Right to Scream. Discovering that place requires that we attend more carefully to certain elements of the novel itself that chart out that territory. It certainly helps to begin with some overview of the tale told within it. First off, and most importantly, the narrative voice that relates it is explicitly not that of Lispector herself, regardless of any similarities we may note between the aforementioned dedication and the body of the text. The voice we hear is that of a certain Rodrigo S.M., a writer of admittedly modest accomplishments who comes to announce, among other things, that he is moved somehow to the creation of a whole person who is surely as alive as I am. This person is a Northeastern girl bearing the name of Macabea, one living out an impersonal limbo within the vast metropolis of Rio de Janeiro, and whose story progresses from varied descriptions of a kind of benumbed stasis to the elevations of love and hope, and then ends abruptly in violent and meaningless death. This character, Macabea, is desperately poor, so much so that she lives on a diet of hot dogs and bologna sandwiches, and finds her only entertainment in painting her fingernails and attending the occasional movie. She is, in fact, not much of anything at all. Unskilled, ignorant, and devoid of looks, family, and any human affection, she is, by all accounts, not even character enough to be a tragic figure. Rather, as Rodrigo eventually writes, she was cursed and didn't know it. Another overlookable existence, just like the thousands like her in Rio, or like the hundreds of millions like her who invisibly populate the globe. Yet she is nevertheless a star of this tale, either the movie star who reaches her dramatic apotheosis in death, or the abject bearer of the 1,000-pointed star that she seeks to vomit as her body expires. And she is also the one who kills Rodrigo, and thereby also the one who allows him to return to life to remember that we all die. Anyone who has read the novel will also know that Macabea's heartbreaking story, this cheap tearjerker, feels significantly more immediate than Rodrigo's ongoing commentary on himself, his writing, and the girl he has brought into being. Perhaps this is because of the fact that, unlike her, he does not appear to be living at the very limits of existence. Just as it is also the case that, unlike her, his voice runs on to the end of the novel, somewhat like the credits of a film when the movie's over. He's a medium, although not necessarily an altogether transparent one, but one situated in between the apparent content of Macabea's sad tale and its availability for us to be read. However wordy and obtrusive he may be, through the very distancing effect brought on by this, he thus also has a tendency to disappear in his own self-expression. Anyway, in its cruel reality, the gravity of Macabea's condition far surpasses that of simply lacking the delicate essential of which the writerly Rodrigo seems to complain. If we are to feel with anyone, it would seem to be the lamb brought to the slaughter, not the mere chronicler of the sacrifice. Yet it's abundantly clear that the more real character of this novel is nevertheless Rodrigo himself. At the very least, his fictional being is one step closer to some form of the real than that of Macabea, in the same way that a cluster of grapes is closer to the Platonic idea of grapeness than any painting of grapes could ever be. However much that model may seem inappropriate here, it's just as obvious that Rodrigo is just as fictional as Macabea, both being the creations of a writer bearing the name Clarice Lispector. It is nevertheless correct for the simple reason that Rodrigo appears as a means by which Macabea comes into existence, or rather that he is the named bearer of the language through which both he and Macabea come into existence. So what does it finally mean that Lispector creates a verbose, occasionally self-aggrandizing, and consciously pathetic narrator to tell the story of a girl who is none of these things at all, yet nevertheless somehow holds the secret of his narrator's life, and perhaps even more for all of us? I think we should strongly resist the temptation to only see in this something about Lispector the human being in relation to her as a writer. Even though it's true that Alagoas, the area from Macabea is said to come in northeastern Brazil, was indeed Lispector's childhood home. And even though Rodrigo is so evidently wrapped up into the business of putting difficult things into words, rather, I think instead that it is in attending to the novel's dialectic interplay between two kinds of poverty, the physical and intellectual poverty of Macabea, and what finally amounts to a poverty of language in Rodrigo, that we will discover something key about the form of the work, and thereby uncover a better approach to understanding what Lispector's dedication seems to say about it. We're introduced to Rodrigo through his brief articulation of what amounts to both an ontology and an epistemology, all in the space of the first printed page. The former is an abrupt statement of affirmation. The world began with a yes. And the latter, a cryptic notation about truth, both personal and otherwise. Truth is always an interior and inexplicable contact. My truest life is unrecognizable, extremely interior, and there is not a single word that defines it. This recognition apparently is that which gives rise to the actual composition of Macabea's story, which paradoxically is, as Rodrigo describes it, an exterior, an explicit narrative, the end of which apparently is not only that the life of Macabea might ooze from it, but finally it might affect the congealing of his, Rodrigo's own life. Furthermore, the truth of this story, and presumably its congealing, is found in its universality. Rodrigo is not speaking merely of himself and his tale, but rather asks that all might recognize it inside himself, because all of us are one, and he who is not poor in money is poor in spirit or longing, because he lacks something more precious than gold. This that we can lack, the delicate essential mentioned earlier, remains coyly undefined. Interesting, regardless of the supposed universality invoked here, Rodrigo is also highly concerned with what he calls a need to delimit. He acknowledges this in reference to one of the 14 titles of the book, the only one preceded and followed by a single period, But it seems fair enough to attribute to him a general policy to hold something back from the reader at the same time he offers something else in return. So when he says that he wishes to head off possible imaginings of yours, perhaps even depraved or pitiless, this is said within the context of him claiming an authorial right to be cold about Maccabeah, a right he does not accord to the reader he addresses. This coldness is apparently linked to his duty to properly reveal her life, a duty that appeals to be based on yet another right, the right to scream, the holder of which seems to be Rodrigo, Maccabeah, and perhaps indeed all of us. But what might all this reference to rights and this authorial delimitation mean? One clue to this is found in a curious statement Rodrigo makes concerning his own authorship. When he seems confident that others like him could just as well tell Maccabeah's tale, ignoring, it would seem, his own personal reasons for such telling, he withholds his judgment regarding female writers, as they would presumably make it all weepy and maudlin. Ironic sexism beside, we won't forget that Lispector is the one who gives this man a voice. This would seem to indicate that part of the need to delimit relates to the manner in which the work opens itself to its audience. While we have no right to any coldness vis-a-vis the slow destruction of Maccabeah, neither is it desirable that we should have recourse to the safe haven of sentimentality. Instead, what Rodrigo says suggests that his sadly cold narrative does proper justice to attending to the primary life that breathes, and which congeals within these words. This would seem to relate to the pure scream to which he refers, a scream without begging alms. This is identified as Rodrigo's own scream, but it's also Maccabeah's. We know this because he immediately relates it to what we might expect to emanate from the millions of unfortunates in the world, invoking as he does the girls who sell their bodies in exchange for a good dinner. Presumably, a pure scream would be devoid of ulterior motive, whether that would be the garnishing of pity or the articulation of some suffering in the world that cries out to be recognized, as would be the cases among those who wish to show us the underside of our clean and proper lives. The purity of such a scream is in the fact that it has no rationale other than itself. Spontaneous, impractical, and sovereign, it simply is what it is. Having a right to such a thing then seems to have to do with the wordless recognition of what? Perhaps bare existence? Rodrigo himself vacillates about the ultimate impetus for his own narrative, since this impetus is not really the impoverished girl, Maccabeah, he invents, the source of whom was actually a glimpse of a feeling of perdition he saw in a random passerby one day. Rather, he invokes his gradually accumulating vision of the imminence of the subject of what remains unspoken and unknown. But to be imminent is to be coming, just as the future is always coming, and just as the act of writing always carries it with the imminence of being read. A pure scream, and the right to such a scream, thus seems to be linked to both life and becoming, and as the unfortunate Maccabeah shows us, also death. We can see thereby that Rodrigo's concern is to allow us to hear such a scream without the interference of that which might otherwise denature it, whether that might be our own interpretation of Maccabeah's plight or a similarly articulated affective or intellectual relationship to the narrative itself. Yet that is, as should be abundantly clear, literally impossible, simply because of the fact nothing of any of this will come to appear in any other way than through language, the essence of which would seem to be the farthest thing away from a scream. But might it be the case that this is not entirely true? I do this all the time in class, and I never have to take a drink of water. When you read a paper, it's drying for some reason. So, after having been refreshed, I'm reminded here of a conception in the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas that continues to strike me as essential to the consideration of any relation of language to whatever it is we're tempted to call the real. From his decidedly anti-ontological perspective, we might recall that throughout his career he strove to extricate ethics from the sovereignty of being. Language is first and foremost signification, by which he means the appearance of the other, prior to and outside of any inherent reference to the self to whom this other would seem to appear. The consequence of this is that language in its purest state does not thus refer to things or to the understanding of things, but rather announces that which always already exceeds any logic of being. It's true that for the most part, this is an idea that lies somewhat on the periphery of what we're considering here. There's no reason to suspect any direct linkage between Lispector and Levinas on the level of shared conceptions of language, ethics, alterity. And there's even less reason to apply a philosophy of a quite varied provenance to neatly account for a key element of a work of art. But there is a suggestion in Levinas's idea that's worth pursuing, namely the possibility that in between the supposed meaninglessness of inarticulate sound and the consolidated meaning of linguistic signification, there is a way of thinking of language itself as being prior to words, and thus also wordlessly meaningful. This might permit us to think of a scream, and in particular a pure scream, in terms of such a language, precisely for the very reason it does not purport to say anything particular about anything, it just is. Now, one might protest a scream does actually say quite a bit. Rarely do we scream for no reason, but rather we're driven to such things by pain, suffering, despair, hopelessness, frustration, and finally, incapacity. We scream when there's nothing left to do or nothing left to say. A scream is always at the limit, either our limit or those that are imposed on us by frameworks of significance. But is it then improper to say that the scream is the baseline sound of our denuded being, the tonality of our most vulnerable, impoverished self? The question is open, but it's apparent enough that what scream does not speak in the language of this and that, it does speak, if only itself. And perhaps at that very point, there is very little difference between the thin margin of self created by the resonance of such a scream and the life that appears to sustain it. Rodrigo and Macabea, as we hear, are both poor, albeit in different ways. Macabea is not only living at the very limits of economic viability, but also lamentably devoid of the powers of language. She cannot spell, barely troubles herself to speak, and is inhibited by a shy politeness that reduces even her most intimate self-dialogue to the repetition of banalities. Rodrigo suffers from none of these problems, but is nevertheless just as impoverished, for the reason his words cannot help but refer to that which is unfortunately not that which he tries to capture. In telling the story of Macabea, he wishes to chart what about life is on its way. For as he says, how do I know everything that's about to come that I myself still don't know since I never lived it? Life, he says, is only revealed. And this is because it's never already fixed. This is why at the end of the novel, Rodrigo finally asks, what is the truth of my Macabea? Then replies, as soon as you discover the truth, it's already gone. The moment's past. The story of Macabea, or the story of the immanence of, is the relation of the immanence of life. He testifies further this by referring once more to this immanence. With her dead, the bells were ringing, but without their bronzes giving them sound. Now I understand this story. It is the immanence in those bells that almost ring. Life, it would seem, thus, is the open promise of something. In its incompletion, or rather in its fundamental incipience, it is the not yet, the future contained within every present. Perhaps it's for that reason that life is never quite captured in the fixation of words, which inevitably refer to that which has been. To speak of this or that anywhere beyond the slim pointer of an indication is to contain it in that past. Macabea, the fictional creation of a fictional author, both lives this promise, and it was certainly nothing other than a promise, unsure, unfounded, and unlikely, and lacks the means by which to put it into words. Rodrigo says she does not even know herself, except by living aimlessly. She just lives, inhaling and exhaling. The thoughtlessness that accompanies, or rather doesn't even accompany the course of her life, allows her a certain kind of completion based on the enclosure of life within itself. Rodrigo says this quite clearly. If she were dumb enough to ask herself, who am I, she'd fall flat on her face. Because who am I creates a need. And how do you satisfy that need? Those who wonder are incomplete. Rodrigo, on the other hand, who is just as fictional, suffers from this very incompleteness. wondering, am I a monster? Or is this what it means to be a person? But in bringing Maccabea into being, he aims at a realization. As he says, the story will end up with my transfiguration into somebody else and my materialization finally as an object. This, as we might have guessed, will have happened through the agency of language, yet one in which the spirit of language is such that the form is what makes the content. If the object to which Rodrigo aspires to be, even his hot head, as he says, wants to transform itself into an object thing, it's the mute fact of being a living being, resplendent in the silence in which thought not even thinks. The path to getting there, therefore, runs through a secret meaning that goes beyond words and sentences. It is an interplay, I think, between these two. And perhaps play is a much more appropriate word than dialectic, which always suggests some kind of result. That we might read the tripping up that Lispector speaks about in her dedication. But now, instead of writing appearing simply as an impediment, a mistake, or a fall, as tripping would seem to indicate, it rather seems it could be read as a necessary rhythmic alteration between that which language seems to proffer, the fixation that comes through words, and that which seems to subtend it, but is wordless, yet is still a form of language. Perhaps in the pairing of this poor fictional writer and his poor fictional creation, we see another secret meaning to which Lispector's art inclines. The only way to reach the unsuspected regions within human existence is to set these dual poverties into fruitful contention and catch unawares what otherwise lives silently within. That's it.